I'm not a gambler, but I'd wager that the majority of gamers looking forward to Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 have never played a tabletop Warhammer 40k game, painted a mini, or even played the 2011 original Space Marine. Instead, they've seen the previews, followed the hype, and counted down the days. Nothing wrong with any of that, of course, but whether Space Marine 2 builds on the original and authentically lives in the Warhammer 40k universe are still questions to consider. The answer to the second question is an enthusiastic and unqualified yes. Space Marine 2 is one of the best representations of the Warhammer 40k world to date. The answer to the first, Warhammer 40k and Warhammer Fantasy began life, as everyone knows, as tabletop games. Warhammer 40k has a vast amount of lore, arcane vocabulary, and invented mythology. It takes itself very seriously. Just about everything Warhammer related is operatic and over the top. Ultimately, the game is about humanity trying to survive, but Warhammer 40k does a pretty good job of building in moral and ethical ambiguity. Within the Warhammer 40k world, Space Marines are genetically and biologically enhanced super soldiers. Beginning in early adolescence, they undergo dozens of excruciating surgeries. This allows them to wear massive armor, a Buick's worth of steel bolted directly onto their bodies. Seen as semi-godlike, Space Marines follow a strict, semi-religious code of ethics and are agents of the Imperium of Man and the Emperor, defending humanity. You play as Demetrian Titus, the main character from the first game. 200 years after being falsely accused of corruption, Demetrian is reinstated as an Ultramarine at a lower rank. His goal is to prove his loyalty to the Imperium and his fellow soldiers. Given the vastness of the Warhammer 40k universe, it's a little disappointing that developer Saber chose to reprise the same character to lead the sequel, albeit voiced by a different actor. I get the fan service and throughline, and in the end it probably doesn't matter much. So much of the narrative is told through tense, jargon-filled dialogue and military speak. It's hard for Titus, or any of the Marines' personality to emerge from his metric ton of armor. As with so many action games, the story is there to funnel the player from mission to mission, but fans of the tabletop games and lore will find them respected. Nothing so invented that it feels out of place. The original Space Marine featured orcs as enemies. Space Marine 2 is focused on the Imperium's fight against the Tyranids, a race of intergalactic insectoid creatures that attack in vast swarms and communicate psychically with the collective. Tyranids come in many shapes and sizes. They use bioweapon projectiles and razor-sharp claws. To call them unthinking killing machines disregards the power of the hive mind. Using the swarm engine, famously used in the DayZ game, allows for impressive, terrifying waves of enemies. Seeing Tyranids pour over a wall or engulf a comms tower for the first time is exciting, fearsome, and memorable. Fighting them is bloody, gore-drenched fun. Whether dispatching them in melee combat or at range, success requires no small amount of strategy, teamwork, and firepower. Here's the problem though. We've all heard the saying, if your only tool is a hammer, you treat every problem like a nail. As impressive as the swarm engine can be, Space Marine 2 seriously overuses the effect in its mission design. The same Tyranid swarms, which are so unexpected at first, become tedious obstacles after several hours of fighting them every few minutes. This isn't helped by corridor-style missions with repetitious goals, bookended by downtime that's narratively empty as well. Over the game's dozen or so hours of its campaign, even the most engaging missions become pretty indistinguishable. However, Space Marine 2's art design is never less than impressive, especially in the sprawling military complexes and soaring space Gothic cathedrals. The level of detail and graphical power is light years ahead of the original game. Out in the wilds, the environmental design is less impactful. Every swamp has the copy-paste look of every other swamp, but in the cities, those environments scream Warhammer 40k at the top of their armor-encased lungs. Alongside the authentic Warhammer 40k settings, combat definitely elevates the Space Marine 2 experience. The array of familiar ranged weapons, bolt guns, plasma rifles, pistols, is supplemented by fan-favorite melee weapons like the saw sword, hammer, and combat knife. Every weapon feels great and has a specific use case in which it shines. Additionally, there are consumables, grenades, and abilities like the jetpack to mix up tactical approaches to an encounter. Melee combat in Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 takes some cues from recent action games. Titus can dodge roll, block, and parry, and use light and heavy attacks. Both unblockable and parryable enemy attacks are shown by a humongous reticle. That's annoying enough, but it can actually obscure the enemy the player is supposed to parry. Other games handle the mechanic with more subtlety and precision. Still, combat is the reason the game exists, and it's mostly a ton of fun. One can't fault Space Marine 2 for a plethora of content and extended replay value. In addition to the narrative campaign, there is a suite of 3-player cooperative missions called Operations, and 3 PvP modes called Endless War, that include Annihilation, Seize Ground, and Capture and Control. As in many action games, the campaign basically introduces the player to game's weapons, enemies, and mechanics, and playing the campaign is required to unlock missions in Operations. Both the campaign and Operations mode can be played by a trio of real players or mixed and matched with AI. There are 6 classes in multiplayer: Tactical, Assault, Vanguard, Bulwark, Sniper, and Heavy. And they do a great job in offering a wide range of playstyles and weapon specialties, plus a deep menu of unlockable perks and special abilities. Speaking of customization, it's easy to get lost for a very long time changing up a character's armor styles and colors. Longtime Warhammer 40k model makers will love it. Like the main campaign though, multiplayer missions suffer a bit from the same repetitive structure, objectives, and pacing. The difference is that a squad of actual humans can approach combat more creatively than of AI-controlled characters. I played the entire campaign with 2 AI companions, Charon and Gadriel. They did an adequate job of saving my ass when needed, but struggled when the mission required attending to multiple objectives. Unless I missed it, there was no way to direct them. This became a bigger frustration at anything harder than normal difficulty. When it comes to performance on the PS5, I had some ongoing issues with sound and music cutting out. Out of the box, the sound is pretty poorly mixed, and it took some effort to clean up the balance. Speaking of sound, Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 has some excellent weapon effects, but some of the most disappointingly repetitive music I've heard from a game in a while. I get it, the action is unrelenting. This translates to a score that is percussion heavy and seriously lacking in variety. I turned it way down, in part because it was grating and in part to actually hear the dialogue. The game's default controller assignments are somewhat non-standard for action games, but happily there are quite a number of options to find just the right layout. There are relatively few graphical options to play with. I never experienced any crashes, but there were some long load times and minor issues with texture pop-in. Like many Warhammer 40k fans, I really enjoyed the original Space Marine. GG Games Workshop has always been and continues to be generous to a fault with licensing. The result is an enormous number of Warhammer video games, but relatively few that inspire long-term attention. The first game was an exception, and like the original, Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 captures the look, the art, and tone of the franchise. That's maybe what I appreciated the most. 13 years is a long time in video game history and technology. Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 obviously looks and plays much better than the 2011 original. Fans of the first game will appreciate the continuing saga of the main character and the seamless integration of Warhammer lore. Action gamers without a moment of prior Warhammer experience will enjoy it too. Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 is operatic, visceral, violent, and unrelenting. It can be repetitive too, but that's best balanced by the creativity and camaraderie of human players blasting bugs by your side.